Senator West, you're recognized.
And I don't have a bunch of questions, just a couple of them. You have repeatedly said that we're prioritizing, that we need this to make certain that parents have a choice, and that we prioritize kids that are on free or reduced lunch, disabled, those category of kids, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. You would agree with me, being the chairman of education and your desk mate, if we can't measure it, we can't fix it, correct?
We talk about that statement a lot, yes. I mean,
right,
yeah.
Okay, and you would agree with that. And so, from the vantage point of making certain that the target population in this bill is in fact being prioritized, don't you think we ought to know, number one, whether they're being accepted and rejected? If indeed they're being accepted, we should know, and I think it's already in the bill, but for some reason we don't have anything in the bill that talks about if they're being rejected. As a policy person, I'd want to know that in order to make certain that the purpose of my bill is in fact being effectuated. Wouldn't you want to know that?
You're talking about with this bill that you oppose.
Exactly.
Senator West, you and I worked together on an amendment that clarified language related to data in the last time that we had this bill on the Senate floor.
And I made no bones about it that I was opposed to the bill,
yeah.
And I'm still opposed to the bill. But if indeed you're going to have the bill, it would seem as though that you would want to get the data that you need in order to make certain it's effectuating the intent that you've manifested here on the floor.
Yeah, I'm not interested in placing any additional strings or requirements on private schools. You and I and the rest of the members on this floor will work forward with this ESA framework on the information that we gather through the interim, and as the program is implemented and as students are using it and on, we'll get more and more information. We don't even know at this point how many applications will come in.
Okay, but I'm not talking about applications. What I'm talking about, Senator, is there's no way in the world we can work on something during the interim if we don't have the information. And we can't get the information if we don't require the information. And so we require information about acceptance, but we don't require information about rejection. And so if you want to get a full picture, of whether this target population is in fact being served to effectuate the intent of what you've manifested, then it seems as though that it's not an additional burden since we're already asking for acceptance information. And the only other variable we put in there is rejection information.
It sounds good, Senator West, but I'm not interested in adding any additional requirements on private schools under the premise that if we don't like the information we gather, we will then make a change on who they can and cannot accept. That's just not the spirit and intent of the bill, to place any strings on what a private school can or cannot make decisions on going forward.
Okay, but then let me ask you a question.
Moms and dads will grade papers on that.
Okay.
And if students are not being served, if parents and guardians and caregivers are not finding what they need, they'll go to another private school.
Okay. You finished? Okay. Then, based on what you just said, then we ought to take out the language that we put in there about collection of demographic information, because we're asking them to collect this demographic information and report it back to the comptroller's office, are we not?
I'm under advisement that they already have that information, and we're going to know in the application process and by survey of the parents and the families the information that we're looking for there. So I don't see that as an additional burdensome string, and I haven't heard from any of the private schools that there was an issue with that.
So, I mean, if you're already advised that they're collecting that information, and the only other variable we're asking for is the rejection, how is that putting an onerous burden on them?
I think it's very fair to ask the applicant of the ESA for information and guidance, and also just how their experience has been through.
I'm not talking about the experience. I'm talking about the rejection piece.
Well, Senator West,
let me finish. If I interrupted you, I apologize.
I know you're not talking about things that I'm bringing up, and I'm maybe not talking about everything you're bringing up, but I'm going to respect what you bring up as I'll expect you to respect what I bring up.
And you should be able to respect that.
Gotcha.
And I do respect that. And the only thing I'm saying is that if we're getting information during the application process about the student, and that information to be provided by the school, and the school decides to reject that student, what's the problem with getting the school to say they rejected that person?
Again, the only reason why we would gather that information is to somehow take that information if we're not pleased with it and make a change. And I'm just not interested in placing any of those additional requirements on a private school, because the very nature of the private school is if they want to serve only students with autism, and they focus specifically on teaching coping skills to that student with autism, and then we gather information that they rejected a student with another disability because that's not who they serve, well, we can gather that information all we want to, but if we never have an intention to put an additional requirement on that school to serve students other than those with autism, then why collect the data?
Well, you would collect the data to determine, and I first of all agree with that scenario that you just mentioned. I do agree with that.
Appreciate that.
But what I'm saying is if we determine that the very groups that you want to prioritize are not being served, and there ends up being a pattern, I would think as the education chair of the Senate, you'd want to know that and figure out whether there's a problem with those kids that are on free and reduced lunch, that are under that poverty level, not being adequately served. Don't you want to know that?
I would rather hold hearings and hear from the true trier of fact in that scenario, which would be the mom and dad.
Well,
and let me tell you, if a mom and dad has taken a student out of a public school because their child is just not being served, we're definitely going to hear from that mom and dad that finds that a private school is not serving that particular student.
You're not being practical. I mean, the reality is, how many parents that have kids on free and reduced lunch can come down to the Capitol, come down to Austin to hearings? We hadn't seen a bunch of those persons, have we? I mean, come on, let's be realistic about it.
Senator West.
I mean, the reality is they don't really have a voice in this building unless those of us that represent more than others provide that voice, sir.
We're all, you and I and all members on this floor are representing those voices. We all have students that qualify for free and reduced lunch. We all have students with disabilities. Of course, we're going to hear from those families. It may be by an email. It may be by a call. It may be by a local event that you and I go to represent our district, and we take that information back. We're going to hear from families that need help the most, and we're going to get the information that they want us to have.
And I don't want to prolong this because I have an amendment that I want to put on the floor. And I know I'll have a few more words to say about it. Hopefully you'll take a look at it.
Thank you.
And be supportive of it.
I'll read the amendment, spend some time with it, and give it consideration. And I appreciate the discussion. I know who you're fighting for and who you're speaking for. I think we want to end up at the same destination, but maybe just are still working it out on how we get there.
And that's fine. But the reality is that I'm not supportive of the bill, and I've told you that. But the reality is that getting the information that I think is going to be necessary to make policy decisions in the future will be important.
Thank you, Senator West.